People die a real death never having been alive. That's why zombie movies scare us, you know. You've been to a mall, you've seen a zombie movie, you should be scared. You don't know how many people will die that never took the gamble to try to live. But despair would be simple if only people were in despair who were not conscious of having a self. You can also be in despair, and in fact, I'll skip some of the other forms because this is the one that's probably most common, and where Kierkegaard opens up the biggest problems with our ordinary understanding of what we are as psychological beings, which is to add another level to our account of our material conditions as humans. And that's the despair that is unaware that it is despair. Now you're going to all go, that's unfair, that's philosophical, that's unfair. No, Kierkegaard says that's the incurable kind. The incurable kind is the despair that is unaware that it is despair. Now the reason that one's incurable is you haven't got the crisis. A crisis will make you face despair, and while it won't cure it, you'll know more about what you are as a self. The kind of despair that is unaware that it is despair, that's hopeless. There's no way around that. Now, when he calls it the sickness unto death, that too is a kind of irony, because it's a joke in a way, because there's not the least possibility that anyone will actually die from despair. They may dress in black and go to Bergman movies or whatever, but there's not a real chance you'll die from it. It won't really kill you. It's not that kind of death. That kind of death would be wished for in a dialectic or dialogue like Kierkegaard's. Real despair of the Kierkegaardian kind is characterized over here as follows. Kierkegaard says, literally speaking, there is not the slightest possibility that anyone will die from this sickness or that it will end in physical death. You may notice that Woody Allen constantly despairs and frets, but it really just means he's a hypochondriac. He's not going to die from despair. I've made that point. On the contrary, the torment of despair is precisely this inability to die. This is not an argument for suicide. It's even worse than that. Suicide won't help either, for Hamlet's kinds of reasons. Thus, it has more in common with the situation of a mortally ill person who lies struggling with death and yet cannot die. Thus, to be sick unto death is to be unable to die, and yet not as if there was hope for life. But when we learn to know the even greater danger, we hope for death. When the danger is so great that death becomes the hope, then despair is the hopelessness of not even being able to die. Now, the only reason that I've taken us this far into Kierkegaard, a brilliant Christian, for him a paradoxical answer to this is a relation with Christ, which he admits is absurd. You can read more of him, decide if you want to believe something absurd. He admits it. He's a joker about it. I wanted to try to lead it back into social theory because I think that it is arguable that subjects, selves, human beings, about whose values we've been discussing, philosophizing, may very well be that the human situation today is one of that despair in that sense. And I'm going to use some very modern and seemingly off-the-topic examples of what I mean by that, seemingly off-the-topic. I'm going to try to use two genres of horror movies to explain the difference. Does anybody remember the old B horror movies, where or even the sort of Freddy the 13th? The big danger in them is that you will die. And that's what everybody's trying to avoid, and that's what generates the fear. But that is not the fear generated in the new near-future science fiction like Blade Runner. In Blade Runner, the greatest hope is to be able to die. You know they won't let you. They will cybernetically make sure that you'll be around. They will record your image and save it, shoot it to rockets in space, and the desire to be obliterated to die a concrete death becomes an almost utopian hope. Now, that you're going, you're crazy, Rick, that's too, I don't understand it, it's too weird. It isn't. Why do you think apocalypse movies are popular? Because they're scary? Mad Max is exciting because compared to the boredom, the banality, and the despair of everyday life in this kind of society, what could be more exciting than an apocalypse and fast stripped-down cars and shoot Mad Max across the desert and a return to that? I mean, it's not that the apocalypse horrifies us at all. Now, by the apocalypse, I'm not speaking biblically. We've technologically achieved the ability to create it long ago. Don't worry about the atom bomb in that sense. It's old-fashioned technology by now. You know, it's well within the reach now, as we know of. Peripheral countries can build them. We're scared of that. It's old-fashioned technology. Apocalypse movies create in the audience, and it's pretty easy to see when you go to them with younger people who are less ashamed to show their emotions. When the big boom goes off, that's great. It wipes the slate clean, and now we can start the movie, and here's Mad Max and these people running around. And the desire for death is the greatest hope here. Now, it's not these kids aren't going to die from it, but it is that desire is even a source of pleasure and joy. Another movie that I could mention, not maybe many of you haven't seen it, is Heathers, which marks this same movement into a society of where despair is this kind of condition, this structural thing. And that in Heathers, the young juvenile delinquent, who they make fun of by calling him J.D., which could stand for James Dean or juvenile delinquent, is a rather uninteresting young man who is planning a Woodstock for the 90s, namely to get everybody in high school to sign a collective suicide note that they're not aware of. He's put another little thing over it, and then blow up the high school and kill everyone in it. That will be the Woodstock of the 90s. Now, young audiences go, and according to feedback to me I receive about this movie, is that this is a perfectly acceptable new James Dean. He says at one point in the film, I'm a rebel. Why am I not a rebel? One of the women in the film says, you're a psychotic. And he goes, well, you say tomato, I say tomato. I mean, who's to say? Well, the thematics of presenting that possibility, an apocalyptic one, as a hopeful one, it only can be hopeful if structurally there's a greater danger than even dying. At least in an apocalypse, everyone would die, and we'd all die. You'd see other people, and you'd be one of them, and there'd be the real embodied feel of it. But to die, to be in a situation where you're unable to die, but trapped in this cycle of despair, which Kierkegaard talks about, which, to refer back to Marx, Weber, and others, may be no more nor less than just the cycle of our boring daily existence without projects beyond these limited ones I've named. Getting a boat, getting some new shoes, resoling the Reeboks, getting the kids in the right school. Under such conditions, moments may arise, Kierkegaard argues, in which, when we really face ourselves, the hope would be to find a way to die. Doesn't mean you couldn't commit suicide, but that wouldn't even solve it. You'd be too worried. You'd say, what will the kids do after I'm gone? See, that wouldn't solve it either. Because what has structured you is this despair. It is you. That's again why we have a lot of therapists, but they can't fix this Kierkegaardian problem. It is not a mere psychological problem. It is a structural condition of the self. My argument here is that under our modern conditions, it is quite general. So apocalypse movies on this kind of account will give us a social compensation for this inability, for this despair, and they'll also give us a thrill. Things could be otherwise.